Alrighty, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Subscribing to My Podcast. Because I have a new guest featured every week, it makes it very difficult to maintain consistent viewership. So if there's one thing that you can do to support me or the guest featured on the show, it's by interacting with my channel in every way that you can. You can always decide to unsubscribe later if you decide that you hate me or my show. With that plugging aside, enjoy my discussion with Dr. Douglas Gentile is a distinguished professor here at Iowa State. He teaches psychology and he also runs the Media Research Lab. He has authored and co-authored hundreds of articles about media and the way that that influences us and the people around us. I worked with him and in his lab for 2 semesters, and it was wonderful. And he just so much lore, so much happening with this guy. So I figured I have to get him on, and I have to just let him talk our ear off. But Dr. Gentile, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then tell some of the viewers some important things that they should know about you.
I was just walking by, and I got roped in. I didn't know anybody could actually do lassoing anymore, but Elijah apparently is pretty good with a lasso, and I have no choice. I'm here.
There's a knife under the table, so he has to stay here. So. Mm-hmm. but yeah, I mean, I worked with you. I'm very interested in the research that you do. And then every time I talk to somebody on campus about you, I feel like they just casually drop like another crazy info fact, but it's like, wait, what? So, and then I read your stuff, but I mean, you've been involved in a ton of stuff, and I'm particularly interested in your research, but can you just kind of quickly walk me through your, I guess, academic journey, and then how you ended up here, your interests and how they've evolved over time, and then just take me to where we are now.
Sure. Careers are nonlinear. And so one of the things I like to talk to undergraduates about is you've all been lied to your whole lives. And the lie is in the form of a question, and it starts when you're age 2, and it's, what do you want to be when you grow up? How the hell should you know? You're 2. But then as you get into high school, what do you want to study? Where do you want to go to college? How should you know? You're in high school. What do you want to study? How should you know? You're in high school. You get to college, and what are you going to be major? What are you going to do for your job? You're not supposed to know. And so the lie is that somehow you're supposed to have figured it out, like there's a goal out there and you're going to take steps in a linear fashion to get to it. Almost no one lives that life. It's not no one, but it's almost no one actually has got to where they are because that's where they planned to be and they took steps in this nice linear fashion. So if you don't know what you want to be when you grow up, great. That's honest. That's the way it should be, right? That's correct. You just go try things. And so my life has been a lot of trying different things. I changed colleges. I changed majors. I changed spouses. Not all of these were planned or even enjoyed, changes, right? So I ended up with a degree in psychology from the State University of New York at Buffalo. My father happened to be a professor there in educational psychology. I had no idea what he did. I never grew up wanting to be like my dad. I'm so like my dad, but I didn't even know what he did. I grew up, I had a soundbite. He taught teachers. That was enough for me. I didn't know what that meant until I got to Psych 101 class at age 19, and we got to the behavior modification techniques, and for every single one, I had a personal anecdote of how it had been applied to me. And that's when I understood what my father did for a living. And psych came very naturally because I guess I'd been around it all my life. And so but then I ended college, and I moved across the country in pursuit of a girl and got a job at Educational Testing Service and as a statistical programmer for researchers. And after a couple of years there, I realized, they had the much more interesting job designing the research than just me doing the stats on their research. So then I'm going back to graduate school. And I didn't know what area of psych I wanted to be. I didn't want to do industrial organizational because I'd done that as a concentration as an undergrad, and it was fine, but it didn't excite me. I didn't want to do clinical because I knew I'd be a terrible therapist. So what do you do? So I went developmental because that's a way of choosing without choosing. You can still do clinical or perception or language or any number of
age,
things, as long as it's tied to development.
Yeah.
So it's a way of choosing without choosing. And my senior year of college, I roomed with 3 other boys, and they all played instruments. And they said, "Hey, let's be a band." And what do you give the kid who doesn't play anything?
Vocals and writing?
No, bass.
Oh, yeah, because there's no bass players in the world.
So and you don't have to be very good to play bass, at least at a very basic level, right? So my senior year of college, I started playing bass, and because I didn't know any better, like you should know music theory or how to read music or anything like that, I started writing music right away and performing out and just had a blast with it. So when I entered graduate school a few years later, I was really interested in the psychology of music. And so I went around to different professors, and most of them said, "Well, that's nice, dear, but what we do is this."
Yeah.
And I met one faculty member, I was at the University of Illinois at that time, who said, "I don't care what it is as long as it has to do with emotion." I said, "I don't care what it has to do as long as it's with music." And so there we go. So that started 10 years of research on music and emotion, and how do we perceive emotion and emotional meaning in music. But after a year there, he left, and I didn't want to follow him out to Berkeley. So I moved on to the University of Minnesota, where I continued that research and then did more. Other types of research on human perception and infant perception. And then after I got my PhD, well, actually before I got my PhD, I got sick of academic politics. And so I said, "This sucks," and I quit. And I went and did market research. So I left the field altogether for 3 years. And then my favorite client was the National Institute on Media and the Family, who were studying media's influences on children. And they hired our firm to do their research, because most market research firms don't have developmental psychologists who've done media-related work. And then when they got big enough to want to do their own research, they hired me away. By that time, I had finished my PhD. And I finally learned what I wanted to be when I grew up when I was 37. Because I did a study when I was at the National Institute that got on the media ratings and how they're so bad parents don't trust them or use them. And that got hearings held in Congress in 2001. And I got invited to testify before Congress. I got uninvited. All right, cool. My goal wasn't to go to Washington. It was to get a debate started about why are they so bad that parents don't use them and what can we do about it. And that one study got this national debate started. September 11th came along and wiped it off the table, because there were no news stories for a year after that except about terrorism for the most part. So, but I saw at that point, research can change the world. And I actually believe that I can change the world through doing quality research. And so that's when I went, this is exciting to me, because in academics, you often talk about basic research, which is very theoretical, or applied research. This is basic plus applied plus public policy relevance. That center of that Venn diagram there, that is my sweet spot. So most of my research has focused on work that has theoretical implications, but real-world application and public policy implications. And after 9/11, the economy crashed, little nonprofits not doing so well. I got told I needed to look for a new job. Well, there are several companies in the country that deal with media and kids, but ours was the only one that did our own research. So I had the one job in the country like mine. Where am I going if I want to keep doing research? Back inside the ivory tower. And so that's what got me to Iowa State and got me doing the work that I've been doing here for 22 years now.
Wow. Truthfully, though, it sounds like at the very least you were following like an educational path. You know what I mean? Like even at the beginning, you didn't know what you wanted to do, but it was like, let me just keep learning and making discoveries. And then hopefully by age 37, I'll understand like what's about to happen. So if anything, like that's probably the best, even if you know what you want to do, that's probably how it should be. You should just keep learning, keep exposing,
and try different things. I mean, that's what's weird to me is that we even allow 18-year-olds to come in and declare a major. They shouldn't be allowed to choose a major until they're juniors. Go try things. There are going to be things, especially at a big university like this, that you could not have gotten in your high school. You don't even know they exist. Go take a bunch of classes, and maybe astronomy is the thing that fascinates you because you never even knew that was a career path, or physics, or whatever it is, that you can find all sorts of interesting things, but only if you try them. Otherwise, you don't even know they're there.
Yeah, well, and I think that's really interesting. I think at the beginning when you're 18, you're supposed to be making a decision so that by the time you're of working age, you are a good enough worker to be in the workforce. And so it's kind of this hard thing where it's like, how do we make sure that people are productive, and whatever that means to you?
Yeah.
And then how do we make sure that these people are also like not ruining their lives by diving into an education that they don't actually like, you know what I mean? Or like doing a job that they don't actually like. So there is a production level that we probably want to achieve just to make sure that people aren't like useless and whatever that means. But
there are not useless
There are
people.
not useless people. But in terms of, I guess, like how a society functions, you know, we want everybody to be able to do something, you know, whatever that means.
Yeah, but what again, one of the other lies is that your major matters. It doesn't matter. I forget what the statistic is. It's something like 70% of people end up with a career that has nothing to do with what they majored in college. And why is that way? Because the business world actually doesn't care what your major was. They care that you got a degree, because getting a 4-year degree is hard. Why is it so hard? Well, first of all, you have to put in the effort. And that's hard. And you have to do it consistently for years. That's hard. During 4 years, is bad shit going to happen to you? Yes, it is. Lots of bad stuff happens across 4 years. Someone in your family dies, or you've been, assaulted, or you got really sick and now you can't do things, right? To get a 4-year degree means you had to be resilient enough to overcome those difficulties along the way. So the business world cares that you have a degree. They do not care what you majored in, because that shows that you're willing to stick to it even when times get tough, because they know something bad happened to you in the past 4 years, probably more than one bad thing. And so we put all this emphasis on your choice makes a big difference. It doesn't.
Well, it's just like, it just needs to be a commitment to something. You know what I mean? It just needs to show like that some of the stuff, and like commitment to debt, commitment to like your future. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
These are things that you do, and it's like, despite knowing that I'm going to be paying way too much for this, I still did it. Please hire me. You know what I mean? And like even that says a lot about a person.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And I think it's important, there's a lot of talk about student debt, and I think we should be talking about it, but we don't talk about what's the difference between good debt and bad debt. And there's an important difference here. Good debt is debt that you're going to be able to make back up. So putting money into education will lead to eventually higher salaries, right? Compared to not getting that education. Putting a lot of debt on your credit card or just buying a fancier car does not actually lead to you earning any more money. And so it's bad. So it's all downhill for those things. And it's a steep, perhaps, incline, but it is uphill still for the good debt. So it's worth going into debt for college, I think.
Yeah, and I've been under some controversy from my friends because I've said I'd pay more for college. But to me, one of the things knowing that I'm approaching the thing that I want to do, I need my degree to do what I want to do.
Right.
There's no ifs, ands, or but about it. So to me, it's like, this is the cost of doing what I want to do.
Yeah.
I also have really enjoyed college, unrelated to the educational part. I enjoy getting to sit down with you and like chat with you, and this only happens because of college. You know what I mean?
Right.
And this is one of hundreds of awesome things that have happened to me. So I'm a huge college supporter, just as far as it goes. But yeah, that's really insightful about good debt versus bad debt. Some people say, I don't want to pay for college, and sometimes I wonder what that means when they say that.
Right.
And it's like, to me, it's more like the badness of debt is too scary for what you're seeing the perceived benefit to be.
Right.
And that's a very different statement than I don't want to pay it. I don't want to be into debt. That's a very different statement, I feel.
And the real problem with that type of statement is that humans are no good at predicting the future, right? There's a classic study called the end of history illusion in psychology. And I don't remember exactly all the details, so I may have some of the minor details wrong, but here's the basic story. They surveyed people like every 5 years of age from like 18 to 80, right? And they asked them a couple of questions. One is, how much have you changed in the past 5 years? And regardless of age, whether you're 18 or whether you're 80, you go, I've changed a lot in the past 5 years. And then they ask, how much do you think you're going to change in the next 5 years? And again, regardless of age, they all say, oh, I'm not going to change much. We're always living at the end of history, right? Because the person you are now is your highest, most educated, smartest self, right? You can see how much you've changed in 5 years, but somehow we don't realize we're going to change again that much in the next 5 years because we can't imagine what that would be. So to say I don't want to go into debt for college means I really don't even understand what the benefits would be, which is fair. Yeah. We honestly can't know what those benefits are going to be, but it's making a decision out of fear then, rather than
like going and exploring something,
right.
Something that you want to do, which you should probably be pushing yourself unrelated to if it's college. You should probably just go and learn something, even if it's not like music. Learn music, join a band, learn how to play bass, like whatever it needs to be. But you should probably be learning something, because a lot of people, I feel like, underestimate how much they can do in that time.
Right.
And so it's like, of course I'm not going to change because I don't have the capacity to change myself within 5 years. But it's like,
or it seems too like too much work, which it can be. Yeah, it is a lot of work. Or it seems like they don't know what they would do with it. But again, that's part of that lie that somehow you're supposed to know. Teenagers are actually the only people who are honest on the planet. You ask them, why did you do this thing? And they say, I don't know. Yeah. That's actually the correct answer.
Yeah.
But we never accept that answer, right? We say, no, why? And then they'll make something up. Humans are very good at self-justifying. But in fact, why do you do most of the things you do in a day? Because you felt like it. Why? You don't know. Often it goes back to what were you rewarded for as a younger person or punished for as a younger person, but those aren't in your memory.
Yeah, it's not like you can catalog every step along
right.
the way.
And so why do you like this and not like that? You don't know. And there isn't a reason, and there doesn't need to be a reason. But that's we want everything to seem logical, but humans are emotional creatures. We're not logical creatures. We can do logic some of the time. But in fact, that's not really why we do that.
Yeah, and especially not in a timely manner, not before you make a decision. It's after, when you're like, okay, I probably would have done that.
I think you're right about that most of the time.
Yeah. So you have, thousands of people listening right now who are 18 years old, and they're like, should I go to college? What should my next step be? What do you say to those people who are struggling with this decision?
Well, I think college isn't for everyone. I think that's true. One of my daughters went to college, one of them didn't. And the one who didn't, I agree. This is not, she was not a good student all the way back to third grade. She didn't enjoy it. She didn't put the effort in. So she wouldn't actually get much out of it if you're not willing to put the effort in. And if you don't like just setting sail into something that you don't know what the end is going to be. It may not be the right step for you now. I mean, it could be in a couple of years. You might decide, all right, I wish I had gone to college. Well, at that point, you can. So I don't think it's necessary for everyone, and I don't think it's the right thing for everyone. But if you're on the fence, there's no reason you shouldn't try it and find out for yourself, because that's the only way you ever know what you like. Or why do we date people? We don't date people because we're going to find the perfect soulmate. We date people to find out who we are.
And we do a lot of things to find out who we are too, and that's valuable even if it costs.
And every breakup is teaching you something very meaningful about what you want next, about what you're willing to tolerate, about what you really care about. And so they all feel like failures. They're not failures. They're successes. So go try stuff. Go take classes in glass blowing or whatever. Speaking of which, I've done that here too at Iowa State. I just went in the new studio. It's very nice. And maybe I'll do it again someday. Because just try stuff and see. And what's really nice is that this is modeled really well in your story of trying a bunch of new things, moving when things no longer interest you, also moving when things you kind of have to move. You have to get out of the way because of some other things happening, right? But you're moving along as new things present itself, and you're like, let's explore that. Let's figure it out. And so it's not even that it's There's a theory from educational psychology that I think is useful. If you think about, 3 concentric circles, a little one around it, and a bigger one around it. That little one is your comfort zone, right? And it's important to know what your comfort zone is, because sometimes you need to retreat there to rest, relax, recharge, heal, whatever, right? That is important to have. But if you stay there, over time it shrinks. The world gets scarier, and stepping out of it gets scarier. In fact, our comfort zone really shrinks down a lot. Outside of that level is what you could call the challenge zone. And this is where learning happens. This is where growth happens. And the more time we spend in that, actually our comfort zone expands. Outside of that outer ring is overwhelm. And this is where it's too much to take in. You're not going to actually learn anything. It's also where trauma can happen. It can be a very dangerous place to be out there, to go too far out. So I think our goal as humans should be spend as much time in the challenge zone as we can. Learn to discriminate. When is it too much? So I don't go into that overwhelm space for very long, because I don't want to be damaged by it. But I also don't retreat back into my comfort zone for too long, because after a while and I think a lot of people felt this after lockdown, that, we spent a year and a half not being around other people. My mother-in-law still hasn't left her house since then, because she spent too long, that this is the only place she felt safe, that now that she could be out again, it's very scary for her to step outside her door anymore. So the longer you spend in your comfort zone is actually dangerous for you. You think you're happier there. You're not going to be happier there in the long run. Stepping out into that challenge zone as much as you can actually broadens, makes your comfort zone bigger and bigger and bigger. So you can actually handle way more, and you can learn way more.
Yeah, I think comfort is, you can't really have progress while comfortable. You can't really chill and then grow. You kind of have to challenge yourself so that the next time something challenging happens that you can't control, which will come, you can at least say, I did this on purpose a year ago, so I'm good. You know what I mean? And as long as you can grow that repertoire of challenging things that you've overcome, some of which intentional, some of which not, then that kind of grows your arsenal to be I'm kind of just chilling right now, even though things are a little bit worse.
Yeah, learning to be comfortable with discomfort. Learning to be comfortable with uncertainty, is remarkable. It really opens up way more doors for you than you could imagine.
Yeah, and to transition this, you've done a lot of research into video games, and then how this kind of influences, I feel like, our level of comfort. Now, a lot of people attribute video games as like an escape, as one of those recharging things. And you do a lot of research on video game addiction and then how that is probably the comfort level shrinking so much that you need to stay there. I guess just overall, talk to me about some of your video game research and then maybe some of the things you've discovered, some of the things that you currently think, having done all the research that you've done about video games.
Sure. Well, first, I think we need to recognize that humans are natural learners. And we can learn from doing something just once. If you watch a TV show, at the end of it, I ask you what happened, you can tell me, which is interesting. You weren't trying to learn, but yet you did learn. In fact, you can't stop yourself from learning. And if we see something over and over, multiple times, we learn it really well to the point it can become automatic and basically burned into the brain so deeply you'll never forget it. So this is at the heart of many of the effects of video games. So if you play lots of violent games, well, you're practicing aggressive ways of thinking. You're practicing scripts like, if you provoke me, I should retaliate. And you do that thousands and thousands of times, you're going to become a more unpleasant person, basically, because you will be a lot easier to anger, a lot quicker to annoy, a lot, and then you'll think that, you should be getting revenge on anyone who irritates you rather than being able to just let things roll off your back, right? If you play lots of pro-social games, people, grow in empathy and they should show up being more helpful and cooperative in the real world. So basically anything you practice a lot, you're going to get better at. There's no way to stop that. That's just basic, brain science 101. Your grandmother was a great neuroscientist. She told you practice makes perfect. She was right. When we get to addiction, it's not that there aren't some learning aspects to that. There certainly are. But I think that starts becoming a little different than just learning. Then we're talking about conditioned emotions. We're talking about habit energy, which of course is, again, often learned, but it then takes on a life of its own. The Latin is actually a legal term from the Romans. To addict someone means you make them your slave. So if you owed me enough money, you could be addicted to me in the sense that you are now my slave. And so at that point, it's no longer just a hobby. You now actually have lost control over it. And you're right, we have looked at some of the things about coping, that people use media, not just games, but TV, video games, movies, internet, social media, as a way of, chilling out, right? Of coping with our daily stresses. Now, I haven't done real research on this next thing I'm going to say, but this is my little thought experiment. If there's an assumption under this idea of coping that's a really harmful one, I believe. Again, I can't prove this scientifically yet. But it's when you say, I need this to cope, you're saying, I'm not enough. You're saying, I'm not okay. You're saying, I have to have something from the outside to make me feel okay. First of all, that's wrong. You are enough. You can handle it. In fact, there's nothing you can't handle. And the proof of that is you're alive and listening to me right now. Because no matter how many terrible things have happened to you in your life, you've been able to get through them, not without scars. I'm not saying that we don't have real damage from some of the bad things. We do. But you actually did handle it. There's nothing you can't handle. And so when we talk about, all this self-care and coping strategies and things like that, I think we're actually hurting people by talking about those things because we're reinforcing their idea that they're not okay. They have to have something from the outside to make them okay. So when we put this into the, framework of games and addiction, we did a couple large studies, by which I mean 1,000 students here, 2 surveys of 1,000 students at Iowa State. And we asked them about their mental health problems, We asked them about their anxiety. We asked them about what were their coping strategies? And we had a list of 9 different coping strategies. Playing video games was one of them. And then we looked at their video game addiction symptoms. And what we found is this really interesting serially mediated pathway, because you could imagine that people who actually have a mental health problem are going to be more likely to be anxious, who are probably also going to be more likely to need or to feel they need something external to cope. And if they choose video games, that's going to push them to becoming more addicted. That's exactly what we found. The students who already had some type of mental health disorder felt more anxious and used games as a way of coping, actually the ones highest likelihood to be addicted. So use, and that was, and we compared it maybe because using games as a coping strategy is called a negative coping strategy because it doesn't solve your problem, right? It's distracting yourself. So the problem can actually get worse. So there are negative coping strategies, there are positive coping strategies where you actually try to deal with the problem. Well, maybe it's any negative coping strategy would lead to more addiction. That wasn't what we found. It's only if you're using games as your distraction. If you're doing other distraction techniques, it didn't seem to have the same effect. So I think there's something very potent in the way we talk to ourselves about what we need to be okay. And can we handle our own minds? Can we handle our own emotions? And the minute you say no, you're putting yourself in a very dangerous spot.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting way of framing coping, because I feel like you'd have to identify something about video games that is particularly admitting that, because that could be the way that we do with a lot of things, like sleeping, eating. All of these things could maybe be escapes. I mean, you have an addiction to good tasting food. You know what I mean? Like you like eating food that makes you feel this way.
Well, let me stop you right there.
Right.
We've got to be careful about when we use the word addiction. And addiction doesn't mean you like something a lot. Addiction does not mean you do it a lot. Addiction means you do it in such a way that it's damaging your life. Eating addiction is not a real thing, because in fact, if you stop eating, you die. Right. And if you have certain foods you really like, that doesn't make it an addiction. A lot of people can drink a lot and still maintain their relationships and keep working well. I don't know how they do, right?
Sure.
But there are people who can do that. So it's not about how much you do it. It's not about how much you like to do it. It's about when it starts damaging your ability to function in the real world. And it can't just damage your ability in one area. Like if you love golfing, you might skip out of work early to go golfing some days. You might refuse to do something with your partner on a weekend because you'd rather go golfing. Does that harm your work? Yeah. Does that harm your relationship? I guess it depends on the relationship, right? Even doesn't make it an addiction. You have to be damaging multiple areas of your life, your occupational functioning, your social functioning, your family functioning, your school functioning, your psychological functioning, your emotional functioning. Once you're damaging multiple areas at once, that's when it takes on clinical relevance and we can call it an addiction. So we have to be careful because addiction is not actually a proper medical term. It's a colloquial term. And I use it even though I don't like it because we all know what I mean when I say it.
Sure.
But here we want to be careful because we're trying to talk about, when does it become a clinical level problem? And that's when I'm willing to use the word addiction. So you may go back to what you're saying.
Yeah, I've heard you say this a few times. I'm a little bit skeptical of this though, in that I understand that psychologically our terms need to be well defined. They need to be specific. Although I do think even with one, to say that it needs to damage you, that's when we get into this standard thing. And then if it's a self-report situation where I have to report that it's damaging my life in these ways, that becomes really tricky to me because then it's you might not know that the people around you don't like you because you game. And so you would self-report, my relationships are fine because you are kind of delusional about this.
Oh, yeah.
But also there's an interesting thing too where it becomes a little bit subjective. So even if I were to describe how video games have affected your life, I could see a different version of Dr. Gentile that would be better than if he wasn't playing video games. So it technically is damaged, although your standard of living is fine. So these are kind of interesting things where I'm a little skeptical.
No, I think you're bringing up a really important point, and these are debates that we have in medicine, psychiatry, psychology all the time, which is, how do we diagnose? And it's not proper to diagnose. I can give you the short version is a 9-item questionnaire. And if you check 5 of the boxes, that's considered clinical level. You still wouldn't get a diagnosis yet. You would have to go through a full clinical intake interview with a licensed therapist. It's going to take a couple hours where they're going to pry into all of these questions, and they're going to start seeing some of the delusion and be able to see past it, perhaps, if they're a good clinician.
Sure.
Right? And so, yes, we need self-report because you do know most about your life than anyone else. But we also can't trust it, particularly in things like addiction. A lot of people say, oh, I could quit any time, but no, they can't.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not addicted. But what's interesting is how many people actually do say they feel addicted. And we should also take that seriously, but not believe it necessarily until we've actually, because again, it has this very colloquial flavor to it. So to see, and by what I mean at clinical level is you probably can't get out of it just on your own anymore. Or it's going to be really hard. Everyone gets sad. What's the difference between sadness and depression? Major depressive disorder. It's when it's gone on for weeks. It's damaging, again, the checklist is 5 out of 10 symptoms in the way that DSM defines these things. Damaging your life in certain ways. And it's not just something you're going to easily bounce back from. Some people can, but would they get there a lot sooner if they had the right medications and the right talk therapy? Yes, they'd get there much sooner. So when we're talking about these types of addictions too, some people do spontaneously get over it. But even for them, it might take a couple of years before they do, and they've done a lot of damage over those years. What if we got them the help sooner? Wouldn't that be a lot better for them? And a lot of people don't get over it just on their own, and they need the help to get out. So that's kind of where I'm trying to draw the line is, when is it a fad?
Right. Yeah.
I do know people who, a new version of Fallout comes, and that's all they're going to do for 2 weeks. Does that damage their life? Yes, it does for those 2 weeks. They withdraw from work and they call in sick and and that does harm. But at the end of that 2 weeks, they can let go of it. So is that an addiction? Well, it's a gray area.
I see.
That's probably, I wouldn't consider it. I think there would be some therapists who would say yes, because some addictions can be more episodic. There are people who don't gamble much, once a year, but when they do, they lose their house and their relationship. So,
probably not right. Yeah.
So they need help. So they don't do it again next year, right? So even though it's episodic, there are a lot of gray areas in how we define these things. And I think that's what it means to be human, in a sense. It is subjective. There are things we can count about it, but even that's not necessarily, always the right answer.
Yeah. Well, and some of the work that you did, you were pretty interested in getting it on to the newest editions of the DSM. And I know that when you started, you were really just trying to explore the literature about,
Well, it's even worse than that. I was trying to prove it wrong.
Yeah, which is very interesting. So can you talk about this journey on how your opinions have shaped? And then I know you've written saying that the question, are video games good or bad, is just like a stupid question. But if you can kind of walk me through your opinions on that would be. Sure.
So with the addiction stuff, I started my first study in 1999, because even in the 90s, parents were talking about their kids being addicted to games. And I thought, that can't be true. You just don't understand what an addiction is. You just mean my kid spends a lot of time and I don't understand why. That's not addiction. Addiction means damage to multiple areas of functioning. And I said, that's not what's happening. So I started measuring it in this clinical way. And the more I studied it, the more I could not prove it false. There are a percentage of kids, and it's not a small percent. I mean, it is small in the sense it's under 10% of gamers. And depending on sample characteristics and your measure you use and where you set your clinical cutoff, you can move that number up or down. The best number we have these days for meta-analyses tends to be around 5% of gamers would classify as clinically level addicted. So that means 95% can play and not be taking serious damage to their lives. Great. But it was never zero, Every single study, no matter what age population I looked at, no matter what country I studied it in, it was never zero. My first study I published on this, not the first one I did. I'd done several studies before I finally got one published because it was hard to publish them because it wasn't a thing. So how do you publish in journals about something that no one believes is a real thing?
Yeah.
Right? So the first one I did was a national study. I got the data collected by Harris polls. Beautiful, nationally representative data of 8 to 18-year-olds all across the country. The type, that psychologists almost can never get that kind of high-quality data. And it was 8.5% of gamers, 8 to 18, would classify as addicted by this clinical level measure in that national study. So I just became convinced by the data because the more I tried to break it, the less I could. And I was at the time also studying violent video games. I was studying pro-social video games. I was studying some educational video games. I was studying, I never published any of this, but I was trying to do some studies on advertisements in games. I was studying some of these stereotypical sexist things that are in games. So a wide range of different, lenses to look at it. And that's what convinced me that asking are games good or bad is a stupid question because, one of my studies we did with laparoscopic surgeons. So a laparoscopic surgeon is the type who doesn't have her hands inside you. She's got, 3 or 4 centimeter holes in you and a light in through one and a camera in through another. And then she's looking up at the screen with the instruments, the surgical instruments and doing it like this. And we hypothesized that maybe surgeons who had played video games more in the past were better at these types of advanced surgical skills. And so we brought them in, they were coming in for advanced surgical training. And we had these timed and scored tests where we didn't have patients on the table, so no one was at risk of dying.
Thankfully.
But we could actually see who's a better surgeon. And what we found was that the number one predictor of how good they were at surgeries was not how many years of training they had, was not how many surgeries they've actually performed in their careers. It was how much they played video games in the past. So I still think the first question you should ask your surgeon if you need one of these laparoscopic surgeries is, how many of these have you done? But maybe your next question should be, are you a gamer? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, sorry. I got to train for my surgery tonight. Hop on some World of Warcraft.
And what's interesting is, of course, they're not playing surgical simulators. They're playing the same off-the-shelf games that you and I were playing. Now, how much they played in the past, the scale kind of topped out at about 3 hours a week. So that's way less than the average gamer plays now. Because if you actually play 24 hours a week like the average gamer now, you're not getting into med school. You're not going to have the grades.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
So what parents and educators and policymakers and pediatricians tend to care about are one of two things: how much time my kid's playing, or what's the content. I couldn't explain this study That's not a content effect. They weren't playing simulators. That's not an amount effect because although, yes, with more play, they were better, but the top end was really low still, right? So it's not an amount effect. What is it? And I started realizing there are at least 5 dimensions on which games have effects psychologically. Amount matters, and it matters for things like school performance. It matters for attention deficit problems. It seems to matter for risk of addiction. It matters for physical health problems, headaches. There's actually a form of tendonitis called nintendinitis.
Nice.
Inflamed thumbs tendon in here.
Is that real?
That's real. It's real. But amount doesn't seem to be related to, say, things like aggressive behavior or pro-social behavior. There's where content matters. If you're playing a lot of violent games, then that seems to predict more aggressive attitudes, thoughts, feelings, and can leak out into behaviors. If you're playing Math Blaster, your math skills improve. If you're playing Reader Rabbit, your reading skills improve. If you're playing games that try to teach you how to take care of chronic health issues like asthma or diabetes, you're actually much more compliant with your healthcare behaviors than if I gave you a pamphlet with the same information. So games, again, are natural teachers, and humans are natural learners. You put the two together, there's no way you're not going to learn from them. The third thing is how things are structured on the screen matters. In communications theory, this is often talked about as formal features. And what do I mean? If you're watching, say, a TV show or a movie where a man and a woman go into a bedroom and they close the door and it fades to black, we take away a very specific meaning of what we think happened behind that door. But if you see the same man and woman go behind the same door, close it, and it cuts to the next scene, we don't take away the same meaning. Isn't that interesting? A fade edit or a cut edit completely changes the psychological impact it has. It's the identical content, but how it's structured on the screen can actually change its psychological effects. And so in video games, you might be playing in a 3-dimensional world, but of course you're actually looking at a 2-dimensional screen. So you have to be able to do this 2D to 3D transfer. That's one thing surgeons need to be able to do. They're looking at a flat screen too, but if they have to be very careful. They push the scalpel in a centimeter too far and you die. They go in the wrong direction, you die, right? You pull it out the wrong direction, you die. They have to get very precise information off of the screen. They have to maintain 3D spherical. They have to know what's behind the camera and where it is behind the camera. And there are video games that require you to do that. So how it's structured on the screen can actually change its effects. Fourth is the context. And we could talk about in-game context and out-of-game context to the extent that, say, you're playing with friends. And let's say you're playing, you mentioned World of Warcraft. If you play by yourself, there are just areas of that game you can't get to, right? And depending on what role you're playing, if you're the tank compared to you're the healer, that really changes your psychological frame of mind. So it might be the case that the tanks get more of the aggression effect and the healers have less of it because they have a pro-social motivation to help their team. Or maybe the tank still has a pro-social motivation to help their team too. This is a good dissertation project for you, by the way. No one's done this study because it would actually be very difficult to do. But the context you bring to it can actually change what the effect is. So if you're getting social support for being more aggressive, that'll probably enhance the aggression effect. But if you're going in with a pro-social motivation, maybe it mitigates it. We don't know the answer to that. And then the fifth dimension is the mechanics. How you use the input device, the controller pad, you learn how to do that. So if you play on a mouse and keyboard, your mouse and keyboard skills will improve. Now, I've talked about these 5 different dimensions as, distinct, but they're kind of mixed up together. Like the context and content matter. If I play on my own, I'm just not going to see the same content you play in a guild. right? You'll just see things, I can't even get to that content. The mechanics, as I move my thumbs, the screen changes. As the screen changes, I have to adjust my thumbs. That's that feedback loop that we call hand-to-eye coordination. That's between the structure and the mechanics, is a connection between those two. So it's hard to actually in vivo separate them the way I have nice, cleanly, theoretically. But when we're asking a question like, are games good or bad? Parents, do ask me this. They say, well, I try to lead them through this, and I say, okay, if your kid's spending a lot of time playing Grand Theft Auto, a lot of time probably means poor school performance, poor sleep, maybe greater risk of obesity from more sedentary time, and maybe they're snacking a lot while they're, right? The violent content probably means increased aggressive thoughts, feelings, attitudes, which may at some point leak out into behavior, particularly if they get provoked. The fact that it's both a driving game and a shooting game probably means greater targeting skills and improved 2D to 3D transfer skills. If they're playing with their friends online or in the same room, that might enhance the aggression effect or mitigate it depending how they're playing and how their friends are reacting. And if they're playing on a mouse and keyboard, their mouse and keyboard skills get better. So is it good or bad? Well, it depends which of those levels you care about. And so the people who want to say good things about games say, well, look, violent video games improve all these perceptual skills. That's true. And the people who want to say bad things say, oh, but violent games increase your aggression. Well, that's true too. They're all true at once because the brain learns multiple things all at the same time. And to reduce it to good or bad is just silly.
Yeah, and you just made me hyper analyze every single game I've ever played to try to figure out like which of these aspects is getting like touched on when I'm playing a game. I definitely want to touch on something before we wrap up, and I think we'll end up coming back to this. But something that I had read, I think on your website, that I found was very important, and this is probably
weird, I haven't updated my website in years.
This is great. This will be just as shocking to you.
It'll be shocking to me because I haven't even bothered to look at it in years. That's sadly true.
Sure. Well, then it's
I told you I'm not good at marketing.
Right. Yeah, we talked about this beforehand. Well, one of the things, and this is probably, to me, the thing that jumps to my mind when you're talking about prescriptions involving video games is that a lot of the times, especially with children, video games get involved so that parents don't have to interact with their kids, or so that parents can kind of take a break and like let the kids be occupied. This happens with TV. It happens with a lot of media. All media does this in some way, like go watch your iPad. I'm going to go sleep or whatever.
Right.
One of the things, though, is if you have a kid who's addicted and you're going to take away those video games, or you just want to lower their screen time, as a parent, you're going to have to replace that screen time with something, that like empty vacuum with like effort and work. And so I guess having researched this and looking into this, how can you help these parents who now have this void to fill that they don't really maybe want to fill, that's difficult to fill, that they don't have the energy to fill? How do you kind of deal with the vacuums that video games can leave?
And it's going to be hell, and it's going to be a fight, and it's going to go for weeks, if not months. So the first thing is be vigilant and try to not let it get to that level, because once it's there, it's really hard. And I get emails from parents all the time, these horrible, heartbreaking stories, and I get, I've kids who've murdered their parents because they tried to take away their games, and they're now calling me from prison saying, can you help me get out of prison because I was addicted and I was not in control of what I was doing? And so now those are really extreme cases, right? But they happen. So to the extent that you can have set limits all along, that's good. Now, kids are sneaky. A lot of these kids, go to bed at 9 o'clock and then they wake up at 1 and they game all night, and you don't know, right? And then they suck at school because they haven't gotten sleep, and then they feel like a failure at school, so they feel like they need something to cope, so they game more. So, right, you see how it becomes a spiral very quickly. I think, first of all, to parents who are dealing with this, you're not alone. you will do much better if you can get professional help. The problem is it's not yet recognized in the U.S. as an official diagnosis. The DSM, which we've been mentioning, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's version 5, text revision TR right now. This is the Bible by which mental health disorders are diagnosed. And for you to get your insurance to cover any treatment, it has to have what's called a diagnostic code that refers back to which of those diagnoses is it. Internet gaming disorder is included in DSM-5, but as a condition needing further study. It doesn't yet have a diagnostic code. We're going to have to wait till DSM-6 comes out, by which point I expect it will be in there, because the World Health Organization in the European Bible for mental health disorders, which is the ICD, version 11, does include gaming disorder as a bona fide mental health disorder. By this point, the research is strong enough. So I expect it's going to get in there. But for the next several years, until it's in the DSM-6, parents are going to have a hard time finding therapists who believe it's a real thing, because it hasn't yet been called that, or know how to treat it. And they may have to pay out of their own pocket for the treatment. Now, the good news is, if you can call it that, mental health disorders are comorbid. When you get one, you tend to get others. I know very few people who have depression who don't also have an anxiety disorder. And I know very few people with an anxiety disorder who don't also dabble in depression and a depressive disorder, right? Because when you get one, others start coming along with it. So the good news for getting insurance to pay for things is gaming disorder is comorbid with a lot of those too. It's comorbid with ADHD, with depression, with anxiety disorders, other mood disorders, and some others. So often they can get a diagnosis of one of those things where the gaming is an add-on feature to it.
Right, right.
And then you can get treated for it. And what type of therapist do you want to look for? You want to look for someone who's either skilled at substance use disorders or obsessive compulsive disorders. I think those are the two types of therapists that already are pretty used to the types of problems that come along with gaming disorder and would have a set of tools for how to work with them.
Yeah, and that's really validating, I think, for the people, because I feel like once you take away the thing that you use to fill the hole, you have to end up filling it with the hole still there.
This is why people who give up smoking take up something else often, or give up, alcohol, right? Because they haven't necessarily thought through what else am I going to do instead. And so another way we can look at gaming disorder is what needs are being filled by the gaming. And there's a theory of intrinsic motivation in psychology called self-determination theory. It basically says we are intrinsically motivated to do things that fill one or more of three basic human motivations. It's an ABC. The A is autonomy. We want to feel like we're in control of what we're doing. The B is belonging. We want to feel connected to other people. And the C is competence. We want to feel like we're good at what we do. So if your job gives you some freedom to do it the way you think is right for you, you get to talk to other people and interact as part of your job, and you feel like you're good at your job, you love your job. And if you sit in a cubicle by yourself all day and just get told what to do, and at your performance review you're told you're shit at your job, you hate your job. It really is that simple. So to the extent you have more autonomy, more relatedness, more competence, you love doing it and you will keep doing it. Games are great at all three of those. You're holding a controller. You're in control. Being related to other people, if you're on World of Warcraft, you can be online with 11 million of your closest friends right now. Or you can talk about games tomorrow at school with other people who like gaming, or you can do it with people in your house, or you can do it over on the internet. So there are lots of ways of getting your relatedness need met through games. And then competence, a well-designed game, especially all AAA games, start you at a basic level. They teach you how to play it. They teach you how to be competent. They give you enough practice and feedback so that you get incompetent pretty quickly. So if you can figure out which of these needs is really driving it, and for some people it may be one, for some people maybe two, it might be three for all, but most people tend to, it's more one or two of them than all three equally, right? So if you aren't good at school, but you're good at games, and you like playing because you can feel like you're good at something, well, that's a competence need. So we've got to teach you something else to be competent at before we just take away the games. Otherwise, you're still going to feel incompetent, and you're still going to feel like you need something. If it's relatedness, because you don't really have a lot of friends, but you have them online, well, then we need to probably get you involved in some clubs or some, or sports or something, something that gives you that another way to do it, so that we're filling the hole as we're taking away the thing that you've used to kind of, patch over the hole.
Yeah, and those are really good examples. We do got to get you out of here relatively soon, but I want to give you kind of the final word. If you want to, summarize some of the stuff you talked about, if there's any suggested readings you want the audience to look at or anything that inspired you, this is really your opportunity to just kind of close us out on this episode.
Sure.
And then the floor is just kind of yours.
Well, I think, after studying media's influences on people, I think it's important that people realize it's real. It's much bigger than you think. You are way more influenced than you imagine by the things you consume. Here's one little example. Kids who watch Sesame Street for an hour a day as preschoolers are still getting better grades in high school. You can see the effect of that one show 12 years later. So if that one show has that big and long-lasting and verifiable effect, how about all the millions of shows and things and games that you're playing and doing over and over and over again? They're having a huge effect on you, and you will never know, because humans are no good at noticing small changes across time, and that's what this is. This is a learning effect and a practice effect, and over time, your personality is changing based on what you're consuming. And so at the time, that you're cut off by someone on the road and you go into a little road rage behavior, you're going to think, I always would have done this. Well, no, you probably wouldn't have if you hadn't spent all that time watching violent movies and playing violent games. But by that point, it actually is natural, if by natural you mean what you would think is normal for you to do. But it wasn't always. But you're never going to think it went back to games or to movies or shows or anything like that. So we should be a lot more thoughtful about the type of person we like being around and that other people like being around, and then consume things that help us be more like that. Doesn't mean you can't still go watch violent things. I still do, but I don't pretend they don't affect me. Right? There's the difference between me and you. I go into classrooms full of, teenage or college age men, and or you can do this with any age people, actually, it doesn't matter, but, and you can say, how many of you think, advertisements affect you a lot? All the hands go up. And then you say, how many of you think they affect you personally a lot? And all the hands come back down. Those can't both be true. It can't affect people in general, but not you.
Yeah.
You are people in general. How many of you think media violence affects people a lot? All the hands go up. How many of you think it affects you? They all come back down. Mm-hmm. And here's the proof. If you play a violent game or watch a violent movie and it actually has no effect on you, you have a special word for it. What do you call it?
Hindsight or not hindsight?
You call it boring.
Oh, I see what you're asking, yeah.
If they didn't affect us,
you wouldn't watch it.
You wouldn't do it.
It wouldn't even be appealing anymore.
You want to be influenced by the media. Don't pretend you're not affected by it. That's what pisses me off more than anything else, is that we sit there seeking to be affected and then pretending, oh, it doesn't affect me. Of course it does, because if it really didn't, you'd stop watching pretty quickly.
well, every dude wants to John Wick and beat up like 10 people who are like flirting with his girlfriend or something. You know what I mean? Don't act like this isn't, you don't want to be that person, you know? So that's a really good example. But Dr. Gentile, it was so awesome having you on. A lot of insightful stuff. And thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure.